Good afternoon. It's so nice to see you, and welcome to the York Festival Ideas. It's a wonderful sunny day in York, and I'm delighted to be here. My name is Rob Parsons. I'm editor of the Northern Agenda, which is a free daily email newsletter which provides a bite-sized guide to the stories, politics stories that matter in the north of England. The Northern Agenda is proud to be media partner for the York Festival of Ideas. I'm going to be chairing today's session. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Tom Heap. Tom will be a familiar face to you as a regular speaker and presenter on BBC One's Countryfile, where he specialises in more investigative films. He has also made many BBC Panorama documentaries on food, energy and the environment, and he's reported from the Khumbu icefall on Everest and a dog sled in Arctic Canada. Very, very varied. He is the presenter of BBC Radio 4's Rare Earth series and was the anchor of the climate show on Sky News. Tom also created and presented BBC Radio's flagship climate change podcast, 39 Ways to Save the Planet, which is also a book, isn't it?
It is. Yeah, there are one or two there.
Indeed.
It's still worthwhile.
So we are here not to talk about that book, but to talk about this fantastic book, Landsmart, a practical guide to transforming our countryside. That is going to be the topic of our conversation today. So I very much look forward to hearing from Tom. So let's ceremonially sit down.
Well, thank you. Ceremonially sit down. Thank you.
So it really is a fantastic book. I was reading it while I was on holiday in Scotland last week, and it was incredibly good example, I think, of what in journalism we call solutions journalism, not just bemoaning the state of the environment, but really coming up with solutions and ways forward. And over the course of the book, you look at the state of land in this country, the farmland, the peatland, the wildlife, the woodland, everything in between, and examine how best to use it. And so I guess my first question, as a sort of general starter, having done all that work, how much of a change do you think the country needs to make to the way it uses land? How far from business as usual do we need to go to achieve all the aims that we want to achieve in terms of food productivity, biodiversity, all those things?
I think it is quite a change for business as usual, but it's not a sort of Stalinist, you will do this here and you will do that there. I think there are some guiding principles that you can read about in the book about, when I talk about using land smartly, it's kind of assessing what that land, what is it doing that's useful? Is it producing a lot of food? Is it providing a lot of space for nature? Is it locking up a lot of carbon? Is it providing great recreation? Is it providing floodwater storage? Is it generating energy? And it could be doing more than one of those things at once. That's another thing I'm very keen on, sort of this idea of multi-functioning land, and I'm sure we can come on to some examples of that later. But I think that's what it's about. It's rather than taking land for granted, it's thinking in ways in which we need to get the most out of it in different ways. Because you will have heard famously this line that given our demands on the world, we need 3 planets. The old Mark Twain line, invest in land, they're not making it anymore. Not entirely true, actually. There's quite a lot of reclaimed land out there, but we'll park that thought for a moment. So, that pressure on land was amplified of late when more and more people were talking about nature-based solutions to problems. So, using the land to lock up carbon, using the land to generate energy, using the land to grow our materials, the bioeconomy, all these kind of things. And I was thinking, yeah, but where's all the land for this? And that was kind of the genesis for it. And so I think it's finding ways of accommodating it, which is the big change.
And one of the key things that I got from your book, which you just alluded to, is that people who own the land or control it need to be thinking more about doing multiple things with it, like you're talking about, a warehouse that needs to have lots of solar panels on the roof, or farmland where they're also thinking about preserving nature, bringing different species back. I mean, how much of that is there going on at the moment, and compared to what you think needs to be the case?
Well, there is a little bit. I mean, let's take a couple of examples. Farmland that is productive for food and also locks up carbon. Takes in more carbon. So an arable field becomes a carbon sink, not a carbon source. There are some really commercial arable farmers who are doing that, and they're doing that by a mixture of how they actually till the soil, not very much, what's called no-till or low-till, not much ploughing, planting companion crops, cover crops, never leaving the soil bare, always trying to plough in biological material. I mean, the photosynthesis is trying to help us out. You know, if you leave a bit of soil bare, something will grow on it, and that's something sucking carbon in from the atmosphere. So if you can then plough that into the soil, you're doing a great job. And so there are some examples of farmers doing this already. We need to spread that. It's about spreading best practice. You'll have heard this term, and I mention it a lot in the book, regenerative farming. That's about taking some of these ideas that are about improving soil, improving the biological life of your soil and the world above it, and we need to spread those more rapidly. So I think a lot of that, and that's part of the point of the book, and it links to 39 Ways, actually, the book you mentioned earlier, is it's kind of pointing out there are some people doing this stuff already. We need to go further and faster. We need to learn from them. But that's why I'm glad you pointed out that it was a sort of solutions-focused book, because it's really a tour of people who are doing some really smart things. So I hope it's kind of uplifting rather than depressing.
Well, perhaps in a minute we'll just get you to talk about one or two specific examples of people who were really inspiring. I mean, there's countless numbers of really good case studies in your book of people that you went to visit and they were doing things that perhaps surprised you a bit in terms of the ideas that they were bringing to it. Were there any that particularly stand out in your memory?
Well, I'll come to one because I sort of went to him for one reason and that sort of reason turned out to be wrong. So I wanted to talk to a farmer who had produced a lot of food. And I'll sort of come on. I'll come on to why. I mean, it sounds obvious why it's important, but I'll kind of expand on that in a moment. And so I went to this farmer who had the record for wheat harvests off a hectare in 2015. And somewhat surprisingly, he's actually in Northumberland, near Lindisfarne, just there next to the Holy Island. And I sort of went to him fully expecting him to be a total chemical junkie, as in agrochemical junkie, putting a lot of fertiliser on his land. But when I went there, it was apparent that, yes, he still uses quite a lot of what would be called, chemical products, but he's now obsessed by the soil. He's obsessed by compost. He wanted to show me these lines of compost that he keeps next to the A1 so that everybody else can see them as well, because he wants everyone else to be proud of them. He goes out at night and counts worms. And he was talking about how, since he's, in the last 5 or 10 years, since he's taken over from his parents, they were just using a lot of chemicals, ploughing the ground to hell, just putting on a lot of chemical, and the soil was completely bankrupt. He realised he couldn't go on that way, and so he's in the process of transition between a productive farm that relies on chemistry to a productive farm that's far more reliant on biology.
That's really interesting. And you mentioned regenerative farming, which I must admit was a term that I've not really come across before. And I mean, how prevalent is it in this country at the moment? And what are the sort of barriers to stop people not doing it?
It's difficult to say how prevalent it is because it's a rather slippery term. And I think that's worth talking about because some people don't like it because it's a slightly slippery term and it can be abused by a big ag or even small ag. It can be abused by anybody who they want to sort of claim that they're regenerative. In some ways, actually, I think it's quite a simple term and quite a useful term. It's regenerative. It means that your field or the land that you control is going to be in better quality next year than it was last year. How you do it is more up to you. There's a lot of respect for soil in there. There's a lot of respect for some of the things I was talking about earlier, companion crops, not ploughing so much, a lot of less use of particularly the sides, insecticides, herbicides, etc. But kind of how you do it, so it's kind of open-sided. So, I mentioned biotech and GM and things. If you want to use a GM crop, there's nothing prohibiting it. And so because it's a little difficult to define, it's quite difficult to say what proportion they're doing at the moment. It is growing, there's no doubt of that. There's this big festival of it called Groundswell, which started, I'm not going to get this right, between 5 and 10 years ago, based down in Hertfordshire, and every year it becomes bigger and bigger as an event. so it's growing.
So people are getting a greater understanding in general of the importance of maintaining good quality soil and not just, as you say, ploughing chemicals in, which is perhaps the old-fashioned way of doing it.
And perhaps another illustration of this. So I used to be rural affairs correspondent at the BBC back in the noughties, and one of the things that happens every January is this thing called the Oxford Farming Conference, which is where, if you like, traditional mechanised intensive farming gets together and talks about stuff. And there's always been this thing called the real Oxford Farming Conference that happens at the same time, which was the much more organic, much more, respectful of nature and all this kind of. In recent years, the ideas have bled between the two. They were kind of, there would have been no understanding, no communication between them. Very little when I was there, 25 years ago. Now there is much more common ground between the two.
That's really interesting. Now, why is, this is an interesting line I took from your book, or perhaps from your 7 smarter ways to use land, which you've sent to policymakers, which we'll come back to later. You said that taking wild land into farming is perhaps one of the worst things that we can do for nature and for climate change. Can you just elaborate a bit on that? Why is that the case?
So the reason that's the case is globally, if you look at the single biggest driver of nature loss, of loss of our wildlife, is taking wild land into farming. So deforestation is the most well-known one of that, but it's not the only one. It's taking wetlands into farming, taking grasslands into farming, taking savanna into farming. That is the biggest driver of nature loss. And there's an organisation called IPBES, stupid acronym, but basically it does for wildlife what the IPCC does for climate. They say, far and away, that's the worst thing for nature. And in a way, it's kind of obvious because, nature likes land to be natural. By definition, however you're farming it, you're going to be putting other priorities on it which aren't nature. So that's the first one. And it's, after fossil fuels, it's the second biggest driver of climate change. And in fact, depending on how you calculate it, some people think actually land use change, deforestation is bigger than fossil fuels. But it's right up there. Biggest driver of nature loss, second biggest driver of climate change. This is a map that came from, as it says on the top left, the UK National Food Strategy, which is something that came out about 4 years ago, done by a chap called Henry Dimbleby of the Dimbleby clan. First of all, apologies to Orkney, who seem to have lost their island status on this map. I didn't put it together. So the bit on the left is a map of the country split into the proportion of land used for different things, not where it happens. We don't all live in Wales, where it says built up area. We don't have all our potatoes in the Outer Hebrides. So it's the proportion of land. Now, what's interesting about this, I think, is you can see all the greeny blue stuff. It shows how much land is taken either for animals or to feed animals. And actually, it's about between half and 2/3 of the UK farmland is taken to do that. And that's a similar figure globally, actually. About half to 2/3 of agricultural land is taken is conserved with animals. Actually, in a sense, more important for what we've just talked about is this area here. So this is the area, this is in effect our offshore island, the area of the rest of the world we demand to produce our food. And actually that area is slightly bigger than the UK. And I think it's very important that policies we have here don't expand this offshore island. There's no point us having a sort of glorious natural nirvana here if we've pushed our food demand on the rest of the world, because that will mean the destruction of those rainforests, wetlands, and savannas we talked about earlier. So this, to me, is a very instructive map, graphic, if you like. And I think it's really important we don't expand that offshore island. And actually, that becomes quite a hard taskmaster, because that means you can't just say, for environmental reasons, I want to rewild everywhere. To my mind, that doesn't wash. That doesn't solve your problem globally.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm interested to know what the audience made of this, because looking at this map, I was really surprised by just how much of our land is taken up producing beef and lamb, so either producing the crops that they eat or for them grazing. I mean, put your hand up if this is pretty much what you thought was the case. And if the beef and lamb pasture section of the map is bigger than you thought it would be, put your hand up. So much more people. So it is counterintuitive to what people might think. I guess that brings me on to sort of a later chapter of your book, which is about behaviour change. And I guess it's appropriate that it's at the end of the book, because behaviour change is potentially if we stop eating so many animal products, and we stop overeating, if we stop wasting food, all of which contribute to this over here, we would not require so much land for farming, and it could be used for other things. And so changing our behaviour is potentially a very powerful lever that we can pull to tackle some of the problems that we're talking about. But actually, it's a lot easier said than done, isn't it, to pull that lever?
It is.
Explain why it's hard.
It's the very definition of easier said than done, behavioural change, I think, because those who've already made the change find it incredibly easy to recommend to others. There will be people out there who will say, don't worry with all the 3/4 of this book that's production-sided, just look at the demand, and as you say, it's the three things: eat less meat, waste less, and actually eat less altogether. I think it's important to acknowledge, because I think it is an important lever, but I'm also realistic that isn't going to happen quickly. And actually, the amount of meat in our diets has dropped a fair amount. I think it's between 10 and 15% in the last 10 or 15 years. I'm not a vegan or vegetarian myself. I do definitely eat less meat than I used to. I think the waste question is interesting. Something I put to the people within the book. I mean, not wasting food requires knowledge of food and cookery, requires confidence in food and cookery. Both these things are considered to be in rather short supply out there in the moment. And you could argue, and I think it's an interesting moot point, will we waste, basically, are we bound to waste food when it's cheap?
Yes.
We don't waste gold, we waste food. And so I think that's quite an interesting one, because although food prices actually have taken a bit of an uptick in the last year or two, as a proportion of our income, they have definitely gone down.
And you describe that as, I think, the truth that politicians dare not speak, that actually food, comparatively, is relatively cheap.
It is, and it's always a sensitive conversation, this, but I'd love to see the conversation properly joined, rather than just put in the, oh my God, too scary, put it in a box. Because it is true that for those on lower incomes, food takes a greater proportion of their income. But it is also true that within that group as well, that proportion has been going down, if you see what I mean. Yes. So it has been getting cheaper for everybody. And I think there's an interesting discussion about whether we basically, even those of us who can afford it to be more expensive, like it to be cheap, so we can spend more money on Amazon Prime subscriptions, or going on nice holidays, or spending £5 on a coffee, that kind of stuff. So we kind of freeload. I sometimes think the 80% who can afford it slightly sort of morally freeload on the 20% who struggle.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. So reading the initial chapters of your book, which sort of talk about solar power, I was come closer than I ever have before to thinking I really need to get a solar panel on my house. And you've got quite a few, haven't you?
I have got quite a few. I'm a little bit solar obsessive, and we'll come to the controversial elements of that in a moment, I'm sure. So I have got the standard domestic solar array. Actually, I've got two of them, which is a 4 kilowatt thing. Now, people think, that small amounts of solar. So the classic amount you're allowed on a house at the moment is probably about half the size of that screen, something of that order, about the size of the slide actually. And I worked out that generates enough electricity to power 2 electric cars. So what I mean by that, if you take the average mileage of electric cars, turn that into kilowatt hours, it provides enough, and then you look at how much kilowatt hours you get from your panels, it's double what you need to run a car for a year. Right? And I was so astounded by this calculation that I've stopped and redone it a number of times. Because in old money, this would be like having an oil well and a refinery in your garden in order to power your vehicle. It won't surprise you to know that I have an electric car, so I'm interested in these things. And so it's incredibly potent off a small area. And it is much more potent than anything else you can do with the sun to generate energy, particularly grow crops. You probably want to come on to that. So yes, I think solar is generally an amazing technology. It's become cheaper and cheaper and cheaper, and I think is in the process of really changing the whole energy discussion of the whole world.
Because it's not incentivised in quite the same way as it used to be, is it? But it is still a good deal.
It is a really good deal.
If you do it.
So, I mean, I got my first lot of solar panels. I got when there was this embarrassingly, I mean, I'm almost ashamed it's an embarrassingly good tariff. I mean, it's something like 50, it was 44p per kilowatt hour when it started, and I think it's been index linked since then. And so, I mean, off those panels, I make more than £2,000 a year from this feed-in tariff. I got some panels much later with no subsidy at all, and they cost me much less to put in. So whilst I think that initial tariff was a bit generous, and it is a bit embarrassing because it's being paid by the starving, the poor bill payers in the back streets of Blackpool are paying me £2,000 a year plus. Is that just? Probably not. But it did incentivise it to do it at a time when it was relatively expensive. It cost £15,000 to put them up back then, and the new ones that I put in similar kind of area cost in the region of £5,000 to £6,000, and they've come down a lot since then as well. And it's one of my real beefs in new homes is why they're not obligatory on any roof that faces remotely south. Because if you're a developer, if it costs me as a single person, a single homeowner rather, I think it was actually £6,000 about 8 years ago now. How much is it actually going to add to the cost of a house builder doing it now, who's already got all the building machinery on there? They bought the panels by the squillion. I would have thought it's £2,000 absolute maximum it would cost on each house. Why isn't that a regulation? Should be.
I'm presuming that's something that central government could bring in, or that I guess local planning authorities could be saying to developers, if you want to build a house in a particular area, it's got to have a solar panel on it.
Totally, and it comes back to this multifunctional thing, because you can make homes multifunction shelter, obviously, you live there, energy, just talked about it. You can do it with nature as well. Actually, some new housing developments can be very good for nature, but you have to insist on it. You have to make it a regulation. And I am really worried by this government putting as a totem, we must have 1.5 million homes by the end of this parliament. Because the moment you've pinned yourself to that sort of, if you'll excuse the sexist term, virility test, the developers have got you over a barrel. Because every time you want to bring in a regulation, say, you know what, we insist on solar panels, or we insist on really good insulation, or we insist that you put in lots of wildlife-friendly measures around your new housing estate, they're going to say, well, yes, Minister, but, that's going to screw with your target. And which way are the government going to fall? I'm really worried about the standards that they're going to insist on for new homes.
Yeah, maybe housing could be the next book. I know you said you didn't have space for it in this book. It could be a good subject for the next one.
I didn't put much about housing in this book, partly because overall it's not actually a very big land area. When the built-up area that's actually less than Wales. The actual extra it takes each year, it's very politically sensitive, but it's not actually very big compared to other things.
Absolutely. So just to stay on solar panels as a wider issue, there seems to be, when I'm covering politics in the more rural areas of northern England, there's a particularly live debate about solar farms versus more traditional farming land, and the argument that the latter is being usurped in some cases by the former. And there is a good example in East Yorkshire, so not far from here, where last month the government, the government approved a solar farm totalling 3,000 acres, so about 12,000 hectares, the equivalent to the size of the city of Durham. The government basically approved it without the local authority having any say over it, because they have that power in certain situations. Yep. And local Conservative MP very unhappy about the way that this has been done without any community involvement. And then there's a wider objection that this is land that could be better used for farming. But your view, I think, from reading the book, is that, as you say, solar farms are as good a use of land in some instances as better in some cases than farming.
In some cases, yeah. So I don't know the specifics of the you did send me some information about it beforehand, so I knew about it. But on the whole, I am quite sceptical about using land for solar. But I don't want to rule it out. I mean, I'm sceptical for this reason. And I'm sceptical about it whilst, and this is just an aside, we have those enormous rectangular mushrooms, aka distribution warehouses, popping up everywhere, and only 3% of those big ones have solar on the roof. I mean, it's a crime. It really is. And once again, it's an easy win. It's one thing I don't get. I mean, there are some logistical reasons, grid connection, etc., but it should be in effect a condition of them being built. So when it comes to solar on land, I think it shouldn't be on the best agricultural land, full stop. And I think if you are going to do it, you should be required to multifunction it with something else. You can mix solar with sheep farming pretty well without actually much loss in grass yield, because although you lose some sunlight, you gain some moisture and you gain some shelter for your stock as well. So you can do those things, and I think that's a good idea. And it also mixes really well with wildlife. And wildflower meadows, one of the habitats that we've really lost, you can mix it very well with wildlife. So I think if you are going to give it approval, once again, it should be an approval conditional on it not just being solar, be something else as well. And yeah, you might suffer, let's say, a 10% penalty in your energy yield or as a result of having to do these other things, but suck it up. That's the cost of doing it. The truth is, although a lot of opposition to solar sort of is often dressed up in the kind of, we think land should be for food, and food independence, food security, a lot of it is basically people don't want silvery black things in their view.
Yes, I think...
Which I get, but,
Yes, absolutely. So, from what I gather, the reason why there's so many solar farms cropping up in this part of the world, sort of North Yorkshire and East Yorkshire, is because of its proximity to Drax power station, which is the biggest renewable power station in the country, just down the road in Selby. And obviously, I'm sure everyone will know this, they moved from being coal-powered fire stations a few years ago, and now they get they get wood, mostly from abroad, and they turn it into pellets, and they burn the pellets for energy. Now, Drax gets quite a lot of government support. I think that the amount of subsidy they get has been reduced a little bit in the last few weeks, but they still get plenty of subsidy. And I know from your book, your view is that biofuels are an inefficient use of land. So should we be supporting organisations like Drax in quite the same way that we are?
No, not in the long term, is the sort of succinct answer to that. I'll give us a slightly broader one. So I mentioned earlier that if you want to generate energy from the sun, use a solar panel, don't grow a crop. Depending on how you measure it, and depending on what the crop is, a solar panel is between 50 to 300 times more efficient in terms of wattage per square metre or acre, or however you want to measure it, than any biofuel. And so, on the whole, I think biofuels, they barely deserve, or certainly in that sense, I'm not even sure if they deserve the term renewable, because they're sort of renewable on a particularly long time scale. My Countryfile colleague who also does Panorama, Joe Crowley, did a devastating panorama on Drax a few years back, showing how they were taking virgin forest, etc., etc. So I don't think it's a long-term solution, but I am a little bit sympathetic to the government's quandary that if they basically took all the subsidy away from Drax now, it would almost certainly fold, and they need that energy to keep the lights on, especially when the sun don't shine and the wind don't blow.
Because it produces a quite high proportion of our energy at the moment, like 8% or 6%.
Yes, well, it obviously varies according to how much time of day and how much is produced, but you're right, it's a big, big chunk. And at the moment, you know, practically, they just can't afford to be as bold, arguably, as environmentally they'd like to be. So I think there is a bit of a kind of hold your nose and put up with it for a while, but it's not particularly good for climate change or nature or a whole bunch of things, really.
Yeah.
Probably quite good for local employment. There might be some
I'm quite sure. So just looking back behind you in the area that's sort of covered by Devon and Cornwall on this map is peatland, which I think is, I've written a decent amount about because quite a lot of it is actually up in the North York Moors and in the Peak District in the north of England. So it's quite a high proportion up where we are. And there's a chapter of your book devoted to how we use peatland. And I mean, are we getting it right with how we use? It's such a valuable commodity, isn't it? In terms of it being a carbon sink, it sucks the carbon in rather than emitting it. Are we doing the best with that land?
I don't think we're doing the best with that land. I think there's quite a lot about peat actually in 39 ways as well. So peatland is incredibly important, obviously. I think that we're getting better at restoring it and making sure we don't do perverse land uses like plant conifer forests all over it, particularly in Scotland. So I think it's being improved. I will confess to one omission from the book, which I kind of finished and then thought, oh, there's a big land use I didn't really write much about, and that was the whole shooting grouse moor estates, which I know are particularly relevant in the upland peat story. So I'm just going to put my hands up and say mea culpa. I probably should have done, but it was too late by then. But I do talk quite a lot about uplands in general, a lot of which are peat, and I know you've just been on a holiday in southern Scotland. I've been on holiday in a different part of Scotland of late. And I do think that too much of our uplands are not being used smartly. And by that I mean, if you come back to the list of things that I thought was quite good to use land for, is it producing a lot of food? Is it storing a lot of carbon? Is it providing a great home for nature? Is it storing a lot of flood water? Is it storing a lot of carbon? On a lot of those scores, in a lot of those measures, a lot of our uplands would score pretty poorly. And so I think if they were in other countries, they might well be known as degraded land in a lot of places. Having said that, I'm not in favour of wholesale rewilding. There's a chapter in the book dedicated to some absolutely brilliant upland farmers in Wales who I think are looking at their land very much on a case-by-case, different land uses, yes, fewer, better livestock, fenced off from some of the areas of nature value, also, farming in a way that managing their pasture in a way that locks more carbon in the soil, all these kind of things. But generally, I would be in favour of using our uplands for a greater mosaic, a greater variety of land uses than we have at the moment. And they would include energy, wind particularly. I don't mind wind turbines, a lot of people hate them. I quite like them. More nature, more rewilding up there, and a greater diversity of farming. So it's not just about grazing sheep, cattle, or grouse, or deer.
Absolutely. Why don't we go? It's nearly 10 past, and why don't we go to some questions from the audience now? We've got 15-20 minutes to ask any questions you like of Tom relating to this book or anything else you might have seen him do within
Please
reason.
feel free to ask anything.
Who's got a question? Let me have a look.
There's
Yes.
a few over here and a few over there.
Why don't we go to the chap there? Oh, so the lady there.
Hi, thank you very much. Very interesting talk. I wanted to ask a question about Dimbleby's National Food Strategy report, which the government commissioned. And I understand that the government didn't take it seriously or didn't act on the recommendations. And I wonder if that was the case and why not, given the sorts of things you're talking about are so crucial.
So you're right. It was commissioned and came out during the last administration, the last Conservative administration. They just weren't interested in some of the headline things he talked about, like reducing the amount of sugar, because it was about food as well as land. It was a food strategy, obviously. And there was a laissez-faire, government at the time who were not interested in this kind of interference in the market or in the way things work. And I also think, obviously, that administration just got swamped by things to do with COVID and all the other problems that they had in the dog days. But there is now something called the land use framework that is being worked on by this government. And to be fair, it was actually an idea that was seeded by the Conservatives in the last government too, because they felt that we needed to be thinking more smartly, more creatively, more boldly a little bit about how we use our land. And a lot of Dimbleby's thoughts from the National Food Strategy are making their way into what's called the land use framework. So it has remained an incredibly influential piece of work, even if not immediately on government policy.
Thank you. Why don't we go to this side of the room? The gentleman at the back there. You, sir. Yes.
It's like a pantomime, isn't
yes.
it? We can play off left and right.
Yes, exactly.
Thanks, sorry. I'm wondering who you are pointing to. Thanks. Tom, I really appreciate you talking about multifunctionality there as sort of your first few points. I'm just wondering, you're talking about the outputs of land. Is there a reason that you've not talked about fibre or other fibre and fuel production, realising that we're about 60% food secure in the UK, for timber it's about 20%.
So 60% food secure, what was the last thing you said?
20% for timber. Just wondering
for timber?
Yeah, wondering if your sort of fuel and fibre is an emission that's deliberate or something you've not focused on. Thanks.
Forestry, there is a chapter on forestry in the book. We haven't talked about it here, but I think forestry is a good use of some land, and I think it's forestry today, in order to get a grant, you can't have more than 70% of one species. So it's not quite the monoculture that it used to be. So I think greater forestry, and once again I mentioned in the uplands, is a good idea. On the bioeconomy generally, I'm a little bit nervous about sourcing a lot of our things from the land for this reason, that we push out food. If we're going to demand, our clothing comes from the land, or our materials come from the land, I'm quite in favour of timber, but I'm a little bit nervous about putting these other big demands for stuff onto our land. Because just briefly coming back to the biofuels, one of my favourite stats is that one of my big fears is that if the airline industry gets to be powered by plants, and a lot of the airlines have their eyes on biofuels as a sort of get-out-of-jail-free card from their climate fix they're in, which it so isn't. But if they do that, it's so demanding on land. Just the internal flights of the United States to power those on biofuels would require the land area of the United States. I mean, it's just eye-watering on land use requirement. So I'm worried about that with biofuels. I'm a little worried about pushing other demands that things should come from our land. I think globally there's probably a bit of a greater role for bamboo, both in fabrics and in, you can just about do anything with bamboo, in fact. Certainly underwear. That's probably a bit too revealing.
Yeah, I won't ask the obvious question. We go back to this side of the room. Over, right in the far corner there.
Thank you. Coming still on the matter of solar panels or solar energy, I learned recently there's a plan for a massive battery plant to be built covering acres near Thurso, not far from here. Is this something that we have to get used to if we're going to have solar power used a lot and still have some power when the sun isn't shining?
Yes. I mean, you say massive, and then I think you said 2 acres. I may have misheard you. 2 acres isn't very much, actually, in the scheme. It's a lot if you live next door to it.
I said lots of acres.
Okay,
but
forgive me.
I can't remember the numbers.
But still, it's a relatively small land footprint given what you're doing. And you are absolutely right. You know, the big weakness of wind and solar, as we know, they're not storable or not easily storable, apart from in battery centres. So yes, I think we are. And I think we do have to be a little bit honest with ourselves about the role that kind of nostalgia plays in these things. I remember going to, so it was actually on a Countryfile shoot, going to a place, it was in Lancashire, not Yorkshire, don't hiss, but where we were actually doing a story about wind turbines, and simultaneously there was a local campaign that was trying to preserve the old factory chimneys. You can see where I'm going with this, can't you? That one bit of industrial architecture from its day was now considered that they didn't want people to take them down, whereas the ones that were of today, they were objecting to. I do think we need sometimes to look at ourselves on these kind of dilemmas, let's say.
As an update, while you were talking, I Googled it. It's 173 acres.
Okay.
So it's not tiny.
Yeah, it's not tiny, but that's the size of what would be considered a small or medium family farm at the moment.
Yes. There was someone had their hand up just in front of the gentleman who just had his hand up. Oh yes, that's it. The gentleman there.
Thank you. The National Food Strategy map is always really good for prompting conversations like this. I'm always struck when I look at it. I only know this figure for England. It could be different across the whole UK. But I think that in England, actually behind that is about 200,000 farms of all kinds of different sizes and all kinds of different specialisms, etc. And as you've said, there's quite a lot of potential for them to farm in different ways and do things differently. But what I think is really interesting, and I'd be interested if you have a view on this, is the demographic of people involved in farming and land use is very interesting. People may not know it, but most farmers are actually quite old. I think that the median age of farmers in the UK is actually over 60. I can't remember what the actual age is. And young people are dropping out of farming like at a high rate. I wonder if you have a view on that in your book and how important you might feel that is in order to change the shape of land use in the UK.
You're right, the average age of farmers is high. I'm not quite sure I agree with you that the young people are moving away from farming in droves. There's actually quite a lot of appetite in the agricultural colleges. And one thing I stress in the book, which is partly on what you say, is that I come back that given that I'm talking about being smart, we need to have a proper respect for and investment in land use skills and farming skills and horticulture skills and all these land-based educational skills, which, let's face it, the educational establishment has been a bit sneery about over decades, and I think that is quite wrong, and that's got to change. I want to see some of the brightest and best going into this, not just AI, which in this context, it's quite funny talking about AI in farming circles because they always think it means artificial insemination, which is rather alarming when you think about some of the people involved. Anyway, but the one thing I would say that I think is, I think I'm going to drop in a controversial thought here. There is enormous reverence for the family farm. At the same time, people will say, we need to bring new blood into farming. Those things are not entirely compatible. And I think we need to think a bit more about how we do get new blood into farming. Other businesses, yes, there are family businesses, but it's not taken as the necessary bedrock of a, tile manufacturer or a, data center, to have a family connection. And I'm not sure why it has to be in farming.
That's an interesting point. Shall we go back to this side of the room?
Yeah.
Lady 3 rows from the front has a question. Yes, pass the mic down, thank you.
Thank you. I was really interested in kind of what you were saying around the government's target on housing, 1.5 million homes. But I think one of the things that kind of unites this government, last government, and kind of across the political spectrum is this sort of relentless drive towards economic growth. And I'm curious to kind of hear your thoughts on that and how that fits with what you've been saying about land use, because that kind of push for more and more growth surely leads us to using more and more land. So how can we kind of be smart about that? Are they at odds, or is there a way that you can kind of marry the two?
I think if you make GDP growth, or rather immediate GDP growth, your only God, the only thing you worship, you're in trouble. A lot of these things will not happen. And the problem is you can have an economy based on fish, and your GDP growth will grow until you've caught the last fish. You can have it based on timber, and it will grow until you've cut the last tree down. We cannot do this forever. And there are things that regulation generally will have, not always, is seen to have a slightly chilling effect on economic activity in the short term, not necessarily in the long term. And so I know people within DEFRA, the government department, who are saying, there's basically Treasury officials sitting above every idea saying, what will this mean for growth? And if it can't be expansion, or then it's off the table. That is really, really dangerous. Two things I'd say if you want to read more about this. There's a chapter about GDP growth in 39 ways to save the planet. Not worshipping it is one of the ways one of the things we need to think about. But who's written really interestingly on this and powerfully of late is Tony Juniper, who is chair of Natural England. He is a government employee. And if you read his recent book, he's really strident about, the fact that if we just worship that single figure, that we're in trouble. And it's quite interesting because he's just had his contract renewed.
That is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's called A Just Earth. It's got the word just in it. Some people are nodding up there. Anyway, it's interesting, that.
Yeah, I'll have to check that one
Yeah,
out. We've got 5 minutes or so still left for questions. Anyone else got any?
On there.
Yes, the lady there on the fourth row.
Anyone right at the back?
Do you think that we are over-dependent on importing the necessary things that you have on the right-hand side, given that we have a growing population in this country? We're looking at expanding house building, expanding GDP growth, whatever, but there's also political changes around the world which could affect transportation of goods to this country, which could leave us vulnerable. So how can we address that and make ourselves more self-dependent?
So as the gentleman behind you said, we import about 40% of our food. We're about 60% reliant. Depends slightly on how you measure it. And some of that's inevitable. We struggle to go grow bananas and pineapples here and stuff like that. But I think this government is concerned about food security. I had a meeting with the farming minister just within the last week, and they are taking it seriously. And I think they would be alarmed, and I would be alarmed if that percentage, so 60% we grow ourselves, decreases. As I say, some of that is down to dietary choices. If we all move to eating avocados all the time, price-wise, as a proportion, da-da-da. Having said that, you've got to be careful about something on food security. If we grew all our food ourselves, does that make us food secure? No, is the answer, because as you will be aware, you get weather and climate, and you can have really bad years when your own harvests are really bad. And one of the greatest guarantors of food security is actually a very fluid global food trading system. Sadly, fluid global trade is also something that's under assault at the moment. So I think they're right to be concerned and not take food security for granted, whether it be in trade matters or in how much we grow ourselves. And I think they should be concerned about taking too much land out of production as well.
That brings me on to a question I was going to ask, which is your view of the current political regime and how attuned they are to the issues that you're raising in your book? Because obviously the book came out last year. I don't know if it came out before or after the general
It came out
election.
on election day.
On election day?
Yeah.
That must have been why I missed it.
Yeah. It was on July the 4th.
Excellent. So literally at the very end of the Conservative government.
It was definitely completed before I knew the result. So
yes, and so I guess we'd had a decade or so of Conservative rule taking a particular stance on some of these issues. Have you noticed a change with the new Labour government?
Well, they have, they are a Labour government. They are by definition a bit more interventionist than a Conservative government. That's what Labour does. It believes government can do stuff, and often Conservative governments believe they should step back, and that partly answers the person's question about the food strategy. Obviously, they have got a real problem with the inheritance tax decision, because I'm not going to get into the details of that now, partly because I haven't looked at it a great deal myself. But what is definitely true is this was not a decision that came from DEFRA, it came from the department, it came from the Treasury. DEFRA hardly knew about it, barely a day in advance. Right. And suddenly it's it's so totemic that it's unfortunately put a lot of people's backs up. But it's quite interesting, and once again, having spoken to the Minister and people about this recently, this land use framework that they've got going, that's in consultation now, well, the consultation may have just closed, but the farmers haven't been, there hasn't been a sort of, hasn't been despised or shunned by the National Farmers Union. In fact, I'd say they've probably given it 2 cheers. In its current, it's still being iterated. So there's the inheritance tax thing is a problem for them in terms of getting on the right side of farming, but I don't yet think the cause is lost. So yeah, I think they are a bit more interventionist, and they could do some interesting things.
And I think I heard one minister say he wants to put a solar panel on every roof.
Well, great, but then they come up with the regulation to do it, and put them on the warehouse roofs as well, as we said. They're not in opposition now, so
they can do these things if they want to.
They could do some of these things.
Absolutely. I reckon we've got time for one, possibly 2 questions.
One right at the top. Should we go to the back?
Oh yes, I've been
right
neglecting the back because
they're hiding under the lights.
Right. If we can go right up to the back, how about the chap in the dark T-shirt right at the back
with the beard?
Yes.
Is that the one?
Yes, that's the one.
If you make it snappy, we might fit 2 in.
Yes.
Hi. I know you talked quite a bit about biofuels. I just wondered if you'd come across a proposal that's been advocated by Dale Vince, who's the CEO of Ecotricity and also a big Labour donor, but his concept is that rather than pushing heat pumps as a solution to heating our homes, we should be growing grass and turning it into biogas. And he's come out, Ecotricity have actually published a paper on it. I don't know if you've come across it and what your thoughts are on it.
I don't like it as an idea because of this, what I mentioned before, that it's an inefficient way of turning sunlight into energy compared to a solar panel. Yes, it's storable, I'll grant it that, and that does give some advantage on those kind of fuels, but I'm sorry, I don't buy it. As a way of using land, I don't think it's particularly smart myself. I know Dale, he'll probably be cross.
While the mic is up there, I think there was another gentleman just in front. Yes, literally right there. So I think this will probably be the last question before we finish.
Hi there. Thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. There was also a very interesting talk yesterday from Professor Cathy Willis about the well-being effects of green spaces. And it prompted, I was thinking about that while you were talking, and it prompted me to think about the fact that you've spoken quite a bit about land use in percentage terms and proportion terms, but not so much about how different types of land are integrated with one another, or perhaps how the types of land you've talked about are integrated maybe with urban communities, and how that might be important in terms of their effectiveness or their overall positive or negative benefits in terms of the environment. And I wondered if there was something that you had a view on.
Yeah, so There's actually there's quite a lot in the book about gardens, and there's quite a lot about urban gardening, which isn't exactly what you asked, but it's related to what you asked. And the whole issue of green space in our cities, I think, is kind of unarguable now that it's a good thing, both in terms of air quality, in terms of the heat, the actual heat trapped in a city, and in terms of people's mental well-being. That people talk about vitamin G, which is presumably as in G for green. And I think in terms of, I think there is a role for much more growing of food in towns and cities as well. I mean, it's brilliant. Hull near here, I think, has the council brought in the right to grow, which is that basically if there's a bit of redundant land in the town, you can go to the council and say, can I grow something on this one? Then they have to come up with a pretty persuasive reason why not, which I think is really, really nice. And also you get into this idea of what are called meantime gardens, because there are often places in towns where they will be developed, but not for 5 years or whatever. And okay, I accept that. While they're going on, let's put some gardens in there and do these kind of things. I think some much more creative ways of getting more green space, either for food or for nature or for climate, into our cities is a great idea. And one final one on that. A lot of people talk about the top floor of car parks. Nobody likes parking on the top floor of car parks. They're incredibly strong because they're built for cars. They're incredibly big. Let's turn them into gardens.
What a good idea. On
And
which
multifunction
to end.
it as well.
Absolutely, fantastic stuff. Well, thank you, Tom, for the fascinating talk and for answering so many great questions from our audience members. Shall we have a round of applause for Tom?
Thank you.